Hi there everyone, this is Sarah from MIOSH. Welcome to today's webinar and thank you for joining us once again. Today's webinar is on managing fire safety and risk, your obligations as asset owners, property facility managers and occupants. As with all our webinars, you can obtain 5 CPD points from the Australian Institute of Health and Safety. Today's webinar is being recorded and a video and a podcast will be emailed later today, which you can share if you like. And also that will include links to any resources that we put in the chat today or mentioned on the PowerPoint. If you have any questions following during the session, please use the Q&A panel on the Zoom webinar and pop them in there and we'll try to get to them at the end of the session. Today's webinar has actually been presented by 3 people from the team at Greencap who are joining us once again, and we really appreciate their sharing their expertise. The session is going to be moderated by Brad Peros. He is the practice manager for property and risk. Just a little bit about Brad. Brad has professional qualifications in chemical engineering and fire safety engineering and has been involved in the field of structural fire safety for over 20 years. Brad, who is the Greencap practice manager, joined Greencap in 2007 following 7 years in fire research and testing with the CSIRO, and has since then undertaken numerous fire safety building code and WHS public liability audits on commercial, retail, residential and industrial properties, as well as managing the delivery of geographically diverse property risk audit programs covering multiple regulatory jurisdictions. Brad is an accredited fire safety practitioner under the New South Wales Environmental Planning and Assessment Regulation. So over to you, Brad, and I know that you'll be introducing the other 2 presenters. Thanks for joining us, Brad.
Yes, I will indeed. Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. I'll give you a shorter bio next time. That one was quite a mouthful. So thank you once again for the opportunity to speak today. Greencap have had a lot of opportunities with MIOSH to present to your audience, and it's really pleasing to have another opportunity to do so today. So today's topic is on, as Sarah mentioned, managing fire safety and risk. We will talk about your obligations as asset owners, property facility managers and occupants. So a brief summary of how the presentation will play out. So there'll be 2 other colleagues joining me shortly. And it will be run as a kind of a moderated panel discussion where I'll be teasing out and asking questions of our experts, and the audience. The audience will get the opportunity to ask your own questions at the end of the presentation. So we'll cover off on your statutory obligations as asset owners or asset managers or asset occupiers. We'll talk about the BCA fire safety objectives, BCA being the Building Code of Australia. We'll talk about some real fire scenarios, and we'll talk about some strategies in relation to managing fire safety and risk through the management and implementation phase, and then we'll just recap everything and head off to the Q&A session. So if I can invite my colleagues to switch on their cameras, and I'll give a brief introduction to both. Our first panelist today is Dr. Chong-Chi Go. Chong-Chi is a principal consultant with Greencap. He specialises in fire risk engineering compliance. He's been in Greencap for 17 years and has previously worked with BHP Steel, BHP Research and Centre of Environmental Safety and Risk Engineering with Victoria University. He has over 35 years of experience in industries, including construction solutions, safety, fire engineering analysis, risk analysis, peer review of fire engineering reports, and so on. So thanks for joining us, Chong-Chi. And our second panelist is Adam Davenport, who's the key account manager for TrimEVAC, which is our emergency planning business at Greencap. Adam has been involved in workplace emergency management planning and training for over 10 years, first delivering training and then progressing onto project management and account management. Adam has volunteered in the Rural Fire Service in New South Wales and Queensland for 20 years and brings with him a wealth of fire management and fire safety experience. He is currently the 2nd officer of the Brisbane Region Headquarters Brigade, a Rural Fire Service in Queensland. So welcome, Adam.
Thank you for having me.
So to begin with, your statutory obligations in relation to fire safety, and this is, I guess, primarily in relation to the Australian regime. Australia is a federation of states, not necessarily a united federation of states, and so a lot of the requirements around fire safety are driven locally at state level, and which does cause problems in relation to lack of harmonisation across state boundaries. So we'll try to keep it general. We won't focus on any one jurisdiction, but in a general sense, this is how the situation plays out across the country. As an owner, manager, or occupier of a building, your statutory obligations are driven by two key groups of legislation, being the Building Fire Safety Acts and Regulations and Work Health Safety Acts and Regulations. Both of these are regulated at state level. There is a great deal of harmonisation in the work health safety legislation, as many of you would be aware, but very little in the building development and fire safety side of things. So fire safety is largely governed by those two broad pieces of legislation, or broad categories of legislation. Chong-Chi, can you run us through some of the key elements of fire safety legislation?
Yes, thank you, Brad. I think to illustrate this, it's best to imagine there's a Christmas tree in front of you, and then sitting on top of that Christmas tree is your Building Act, and then it just flows now from the Building Act that calls out the regulation. So in terms of building construction, and the Act will call out the regulations, and the regulation will then have a certain aspect that you need to meet. And then that would be addressed for the building construction, it will be addressed in the Building Code of Australia, which is the BCA. And then the BCA will give you a minimum requirement in terms of how to achieve the fire safety objectives by having certain design parameters to be included. And in terms of fire system maintenance and certification, they are actually called out in the regulations, which means that they need to be complied with. Any requirements that are called out in the Act, regulation, the building code, they are mandatory. They need to be implemented. So that is a nutshell of the regulatory framework that drives fire safety in the industry.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Chong-Chi. And Adam, can you tell us where emergency planning fits into this? I understand it's not referenced by the building code, or not necessarily referenced in fire safety legislation, but how does emergency planning fit into this?
Yeah, that's right, Brad. So emergency planning, and remember when Brad talks to me, everyone, I'm the people person. So Chong-Chi's talking about the building and the building codes as such. I'm more about how people react to what the building needs to do. So in Australia, mostly, it talks about in the work health and safety regulations what an emergency plan is and what needs to be done to look after our occupants. It doesn't give you a lot of detail. So individual states and territories do have different regulations, like the Queensland Building Fire Safety Regulation talks about further details of what needs to be done in Queensland, same with Tasmania and WA. If we want to follow best practices and a compliance way of doing our emergency planning, it comes to the Australian Standard 3745, Planning for Emergencies in Facilities. There's also a different standard when it comes to healthcare. Overarchingly, really when we look at each individual building, be it a residential, warehouse, commercial facility, whatever it is, we need to show best duty of care. So making sure we analyse what our staff are doing within the building, what the building capacity does for us, relating back to that Building Code of Australia, and making sure that we are implementing the best possible procedures to ensure that all of our staff can get home safely at the end of the day to see our family and friends.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Adam. And look, we touched on the Building Code of Australia in that previous slide. Chong-Chi spoke briefly about it. And you did acknowledge that any new building work does need to be done in conformance with the Building Code of Australia, and that obviously is the current standard that applies across the nation. Every state calls up that code as the baseline construction code for any new development work. So it does set a minimum standard of fire safety, and it has 4 declared objectives, and those are occupant safety, safety of the fire brigade, of the avoidance of spread to other buildings, and the avoidance of damage to adjacent buildings. Now, Chong-Chi, something's missing from this. What is it?
Yeah, I think when people look at this slide, they say, what happened to my own property? We are only looking at the occupant safety and the brigade, and then the spread to other buildings and damage. What about my own asset? How do I protect my own asset? In fact, in the design stage, when all the various stakeholders get together, one of the key objectives is to the asset protection from the asset owner's perspective. So it's, when you look at the BCA fire safety objectives and then you start implementing the requirements, inherently the asset is protected. However, it is not actually addressed explicitly in the BCA. For example, if you have a data center or IT system that you need to protect, you may want to put in a gaseous suppression system or VESTA system. These are not required in the BCA. It's for your own asset protection.
Yeah, right. And Adam, these objectives aren't, they're in the BCA, they're baked into the BCA, so they don't, not necessarily directly cross-reference the emergency planning, but how does emergency planning actually help achieve these BCA objectives?
Yeah, so since there isn't a direct link between the two, we still need to think about what does the building do for our occupants. So our occupants need to know exactly what the building does in the case of an emergency. And we do that in a couple of ways. So a lot of buildings around Australia should have 2 levels, if not 3 levels of emergency preparedness and teams that would look at our planning. The first one is emergency planning committee. So it's normally a management group, not necessarily the responders, just people that are going to review all of the emergency procedures and what the building does for us. Then we have our emergency control organisation, so the warden team. That's the organisation that controls the emergency, if I flip it around for you, before emergency services arrive. Some warehouses, high-risk facilities that have some risk to their facilities, so such as things as flammable materials or gases, may have an emergency response team as well. So all of these work together to make sure that we are responding to what the building does for us, educating ourselves on where refuge areas are, safe havens, fire exits, things like that, and passing that knowledge on to all of our occupants. Because one big miss that we do in Australia is that in a workplace, in even residential buildings, anywhere that we go into, everyone should know what needs to be done in the case of an emergency. So passing that information on is really critical through normal stand-up meetings, PA systems potentially, or even just educating our staff or any occupants as they enter the building through inductions, things like that.
Yeah, great. And I guess that's from the people side. Shangchi, from a hardware side, from the perspective of the fire safety installations that the building code actually asks you to install, how does all that go to meeting these BCA objectives?
I think that would be best explained in the next slide. Brad, could you put on the next slide, please? Look, basically, obviously, we need to know what we need to manage in the first place before we can manage a risk. And the fire safety system requirements in the building, they are all detailed in the BCA. Depending on the use of the building and the class of the building, some buildings may require sprinkler protection, some may require smoke extraction, compartmentalization, what are the FRL, the fire resistance levels, and evacuation, what's the travel distance, how many exits do we need to have in a building. Knowing all these aspects will help you then holistically look at the building and then put in the effort in terms of installation and maintenance. So these requirements are detailed in the BCA, and whether the sprinkler is required depends on the BCA requirements, whether it depends on the class of the building. So this will set up the basic framework for the building manager and the occupants to make sure that the systems are being maintained and operate.
Yeah, great. And look, I think it's important to reiterate that the building code sets the minimum standard. There's nothing stopping an asset owner from going above and beyond that, but it sets the absolute minimum standard of fire safety within buildings. So that I guess captures the broad framework of fire safety in terms of how it's all structured, how the legislation works in with the building code and evacuation planning standards and so on. So before we talk about strategy for managing risk, let's just have review some recent major fires that have been quite prominent in the news recently, some more prominent than others. Perhaps one of the most prominent of all that occurred nearly 4 years ago, if you can believe that, was the Grenfell fire in June 2017. So that fire started in the early hours of the morning. Cause of fire spread was combustible cladding, and we know combustible cladding is massively in the news now, or has been ever since that day, and resulted in a number of deaths and injuries, as well as a large number of evacuations from that property. A couple of other examples recently, More recently in 2019, again, early hours of the morning, a factory in Campbellfield, I believe that's in Melbourne, Chongqi, resulted in a couple of injuries, no deaths. 30 persons were evacuated at the time, and it took 4 days to extinguish the fire. Again, another one in Melbourne, West Footscray in 2018, early hours of the morning. Sources within the building involved dangerous chemicals. The fire was extinguished over several days or about a week as a result of hotspots. And finally, another one more recently, only last month in southwest Sydney, in Preston, suburb of Preston. Again, early in the hours of the morning, the fuel sources in the building were brake fluid, insecticide, and LPG cylinders. No deaths, no injuries, and 2 persons evacuated from that. So, interestingly, Chongqi, for all the major fires that we saw just now, there is one common aspect of these fires. Big fires tend to occur in the early part of the morning. The fire safety systems installed in the buildings remain the same no matter what time fire occurs. Right, sprinklers, same sprinkler systems there at noon as it is at 4 o'clock in the morning. But is there a reason why these fires are occurring? These major fires are occurring in the early hours of the morning?
Yeah, this is a good one, Brad. I mean, yes, in fact, many a times when you wake up in the morning, you turn on the radio. At times you hear that there's a big fire occur in the suburb or in the industrial area. In fact, the main reason is that people, you and I, who are awake, we are the best detector. That's why you don't get to see a lot of major fires happening during the day, because most of the fires, when they are detected by human, they are extinguished in a very early stage and by human intervention. So most of these small fires are dealt with locally and normally do not spread beyond the room of origin. So we, the people, are the best detector, and that I can assure of if we are awake and aware and knowing what's happening in the building.
Yeah, great. And Adam, from an emergency management perspective, what's the significance of when a fire starts?
So it's an interesting question, and Chongqi is absolutely right when it talks about that humans are the best detectors. We will be able to smell smoke, hear crackling, people saying, hey, what's that going on? And we'll be able to respond to it accordingly. The interesting factor with the time in the morning with all these emergencies really have occurred is that we tend to think when alarms go off, and treat this like an exercise where you're watching this presentation. Think about when you've gone to a shopping centre and you've heard a fire alarm go off. What do you firstly do? People don't go, oh, where's my exit? They go, I'm just going to keep shopping. If you're at home, you hear a security alarm go off. People go, oh, can someone turn that off? When we do have occupants in the building, be it in residential as well, people normally think, oh, the alarm's going off, someone's burnt the toast again. Oh, someone's had a hot shower and the steam's activated the detector. The complacency we have at the moment is quite risky from a occupant perspective. So if people are there, we shouldn't be complacent about it, because if we're complacent, there's going to be a bit of chaos when we do actually start to see smoke and flames or the potential risk of what's going on. When that does happen, the panic sets in, and when our human reaction, we can have a fight, flight, or freeze mentality. So it depends on what could happen and how our human reaction is to that emergency. The best thing we can do, though, realistically, is be prepared. It's the first thing I really mentioned at the top of the presentation when I started talking. Prepare for your emergencies and ensure that you know what should really be happening prior to those alarms going off.
Yeah, great, thank you. And I guess this is a great opportunity while we're speaking about emergency planning, is to you, the audience, if you have any concerns about your own emergency plan that you have in place within your occupancy, within your workplace, within your facility, within the asset that you own, then here's a QR code. So if you have your mobile phones handy, please feel free to scan this QR code in. It will take you to a form where if you fill it out, Adam himself, I believe, will be in touch to let you know whether your emergency plan is effectively compliant.
Brad, I'll just let you know I shared that link in the chat as well for everyone.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. So, gents, what can we learn from these major fires that we saw over the past few slides? Chongqi, do you want to go first?
Well, looking at those photos and looking at some historical data, we know that severe fires are hard to control. The whole thing about fire safety management is about maintaining control. Once it grows to beyond a certain stage, it's become very, very difficult to maintain control or even to combat the fire. As you will see from the news, sometimes it takes fire brigade days to even put out a fire. So severe fires are very hard to control. and they can easily spread. Once the building collapses, and then it's no longer contained within the perimeter, the flame will spread, and then any adjoining building that is close to the building could catch a fire. And in some cases, you have total building collapse, and if not destruction, and to the asset owner, there will be loss of business. And the setting is that there could be potential fatalities or even injury coming up from these severe fires.
Yeah, and I think what Chong Chi is actually talking about there on as well is that when it comes to the facilities and what people do, and well, as we saw, the fatalities that can potentially occur as well, we need to understand that realistically that we do have a situation of where we need to know what the building does for us. So safe refuge area is really important. Talking about where we go in the case of those emergencies. Training is a really big factor in this as well from a human perspective. So training 6 monthly for wardens, occupants being trained annually, and visitors, contractors, just be giving a brief of when we've got an emergency, when they come to our sites, I should say, not for when an emergency occurs. They should be prepared for those types of things. So communication with our staff, occupants, any contractors is so important, and the delivery models of these as well is critical.
Yeah, great. So when it comes to managing fire safety and risk, then what are the core areas of focus that facility managers should really drill down and really focus on to ensure that that's being managed adequately? Chong Chi?
Look, I think there are many key considerations for fire safety. As we saw just now in those fires that we showed you, I mean, trying to combat a severe fire is going to be very, very, very difficult. The whole idea of risk management is, in the first place, to minimize a fire start. So surveillance of critical areas to avoid any deliberate fire start, and its surveillance is very, very good, because that's why you see the major fires happen overnight, because there's lack of security in some ways that could lead to some form of arson and so forth. Good housekeeping in terms of storage combustible. I mean, if combustible are stored near to the ignition source, the tendency is that if there's a fire start, it's going to burn, and then from the burning point object, it will then spread. And from statistics, we also know that electrical and mechanical system tend to be the major cause in terms of fire start with the faulty equipment. And good maintenance, regular fire safety auditing in terms of identifying whether the building has changed, and the storage system and so forth. And one very important point I will raise a bit later is about the refurbishment. And we tend to find that from, again, historical data, that some of the major fires are caused during refurbishment. And obviously, extinguish the fire when they're small, and with a good firefighting equipment. Most of us are trained to use firefighting equipment. Whether or not we've been allowed or asked to use it is another separate issue. But the fact that the fire extinguishers are there in a building and required in a BCA, they are meant to be there to combat the fire when they're still small. And obviously, that's you need to be trained to do it, and then this equipment need to be maintained. And lastly, obviously, from Adam's perspective, and for many of us who actually work in the office building or many other buildings, we need to make sure that we can evacuate the building.
Yeah, great. And Adam, Chong Chi mentioned regular fire safety auditing. What's your view on that?
So fire safety auditing, it's really important to mention just straight off the very top is that our management team or our work health and safety teams should be involved when it comes to doing auditing for fire safety. Some people think it comes down to the warden team to do all those reviews. If we have leadership from the front, and when we're doing our emergency preparedness and managers involved, we get a better response from all of our occupants and any sort of residents, making sure that we're dealing with the emergencies prior to them occurring. So reviewing your building's capacity of what it can do, checking egress paths, Chong Chi mentioned about that, making sure they're clear at all times. Knowing that your fire stairs doesn't have things blocking exits or blocking doors from opening. It is a problem we see a lot. People go, I've got a crate or a box. I'm going to throw this in the fire stairs. It'll be fine. And sometimes we see that too late. So some of the things we can use to make sure we're being proactive in checking these things, if I go to the Australian standards, so for compliance, using a gap analysis to ensure that we're following all the steps of what that says of how we can make sure we're checking our paths, making sure we've got enough wardens, making sure our plans are prepared correctly. The best practice in Australia, though, I have to say, is in Queensland. Queensland has a fire safety advisor. It's underneath the building fire safety regulation, and annually that person who's the fire safety advisor has to do an inspection that includes all of the extinguishment equipment, the maintenance, egress paths, the lighting in the building. It goes through everything. I think it's fantastic, and it was, just for everyone's knowledge, it was implemented after the Childers Backpackers fire. It's something that is hugely worthwhile in the way that it covers off everything. We can show the things that are being non-compliant with that check and fix them before we have those emergencies occur to better prepare ourselves.
Yeah, great. Really good point about the building fire safety regulation arising from the Childers Backpackers hostel fire. Most fire safety legislation and BCA improvements are highly reactionary, and they are a direct response to major incidents. That's a great example of one. Combustible cladding is another. Sprinklers in aged care facilities is another, following the Quakers Hill fire in New South Wales. So some plenty of examples of just a reactionary approach to fire safety by the regulators. Chong-Chi, you referred to work practices for maintenance staff a little while ago. What do you mean by that? Can you flesh that out a bit?
Yes, I mean, from time to time, we know that during refurbishment work, that's where tendency of a fire start. Other than the electrical and mechanical component, during refurbishment, that's when you do a lot of hot working and so forth. So the whole idea of building refurbishment is to make sure that we have a formalized work practices for contractors. Housekeeping, again, provision of extinguisher at the proximities of where you're working, and then minimize welding and cutting. If those things can be done off-site and then bring in, then trying to do the welding and cutting on-site, and undertake regular audits to make sure that we all adhere to the practices. And then yes, we know that contractors will put in the sweeps and all that, and then we need to make sure that we are adhering to the procedures that we are looking at. And obviously system impairment, to let the insurance company knows that certain things are happening, and so forth. The other thing is that when the building is in refurbishment or totally gut out or what have you, sprinkler system tends to get isolated. And then it is very important to know that which area can you isolate? Can you just isolate the areas that you're only working on? Or in some of the older buildings, one installation actually covers 3 or 4 stories. And then in that case, you actually having to isolate 3 to 4 floors. However, the work is only conducted on one particular floor. So these are the things that you need to think through and work through to make sure that anything that are impaired, you must have a redundancy there to make sure that you could come back if there's an ignition. And obviously, the other thing is egress. Many times that during refurbishment work, and then you tend to find that the egress are being obstructed because of extra materials being stored in that area. So these are the things that you need to revisit to make sure that in the event of a fire, we are able to evacuate the building safely.
Yeah, great. Yeah, look, dead right about isolations during refurbishment work. Some contractors will take the view that they'll isolate as much as possible, and thereby just increasing the risk more broadly to the building unnecessarily, rather than just isolating the work area. They'll isolate an area much larger than that, sometimes the entire building, and obviously cause issues in terms of early warning and fire brigade response as well if you're isolating critical detection systems or sprinkler systems and so on. And look, Greencap have in TrimEVAC done plenty of audits over the years, fire safety audits. So I think it's fair to say we've seen it all when it comes to inappropriate fire safety management of a facility or of a workplace or of an asset. These are some highlights or lowlights, perhaps, that Adam has volunteered. Adam, would you like to speak us through some of these?
Yeah, not a problem, Brad. And I'm going to put this human factor to each of these photos as well, everyone. So when we look at the first one on the left with the fire hose reel, which is red, that big red thing, you can see how many items are being placed in this cupboard. So you open it up, maybe someone needs to use the reel to put out a fire that's, at risk of someone's life. Even as a firefighter, I look at that and it's very hard to see, but there's a brass wheel there where the hydrant is. as a firefighter, those seconds can be vital. So let's try and have a look when we're trying to prepare our buildings for emergencies, that we keep all of our items out of these cupboards. Cleaning materials are the worst that we normally see. Then the second photo is the fire door. Now this is chocked open, and there's a definite problem when it comes to a fire being in, say, that floor and breaking compartmentization. So those doors lead into a fire restricted environment. When we've got occupants that may have a disability of some type that need to go into a refuge area and get away from that fire, we use those fire stairs and we keep them on that platform until firefighters can carry them downstairs in a safe manner. Same with obviously everyone evacuating the building. So don't chock open the doors, because if you chock open the doors, emergency occurs, that smoke can potentially go into that environment, and you've got carbon monoxide risk there going into that environment where it should be a safe haven. The next photo, I think it's pretty clear. This is an exit. It's the sign shows you it's an exit stairs. We just can't get to it. I remember this photo clearly. It was done down in Victoria. I won't say any more of where it actually is. The thing is here that we took about 5 minutes just to move those bins. When even that wasn't even an emergency. So it's a long time, and we've got to make sure these things are kept clear. The worst thing to that is the last photo, the one with the pot plant. It's hard to see, but that door that's actually behind all that is an exit door. People come down from upstairs. It's a high-rise building. They would push that door and they wouldn't be able to open it. So these things will be picked up if we do our preemptive checks, those checklists, gap analysis, inspections, to make sure that we've got ourselves ready to go in an emergency and not have these, well, very simple problems fixed.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Adam. And a few more here that I've put up, so I'll talk you through each of these. The first one's an interesting one. The site team have obviously made an effort to address the safety issues associated with the edge of a fire hose reel, but it has created other problems. One is that the instructions are now no longer visible behind the sign, and the padding they've put around the rim of the reel as well has will potentially interfere with the deployment of the hose or the unwinding of the hose. So a few issues there. They've tried to do the right thing and they've kind of messed it up a little bit. The next photo is sadly something we see quite often. It's a dust cap over a smoke detector. That orange thing is a dust cap. So when refurbishment works are happening, I'll put the dust cap on to protect the detector from ingress of dust, which is great. But often they get missed when it's time to remove them. Usually in the areas, the open plan areas, that they will get spotted because they're highly visible. But one's in storerooms, one in server rooms, and perhaps little rooms tucked away. Those ones get missed, and the dust cap sits there and effectively completely renders the detector inoperable. The detector simply won't sense smoke, and it impairs the system as a result. The third photo there is a standard exit door. Looks okay at first glance, but the site team, due to security concerns, have actually added a deadbolt to the top, in that top right-hand corner that you can hopefully see in that photograph. So that's rendered that door non-compliant from an egress perspective. The door must be openable with a single-handed action from the side-facing egress. So you can see that it's going to be at least two actions required to open that door. One is to open that deadbolt, and the other then is to pull down on that lever handle. And the last photo there is perhaps a more insidious issue, and this often happens in an industrial setting, a storage facility. Storage no longer compatible with the sprinkler system. So some of those fires that you saw in those major fire examples involving loss of entire properties. Sprinkler systems are very effective when the storage matches the design criteria of the sprinklers. When it doesn't, a fire can overwhelm the sprinkler system and then completely take out an asset. So storage not matching the sprinkler design criteria is an important and a very common thing that we see at Greencap. So look, we'll take questions from the audience shortly, but Adam, we touched on a few key issues around fire safety risk management, but what are the key takeaways from your perspective from an emergency management side of things?
So I've mentioned these three words, I think twice already, but I definitely want to mention it one last time. So prepare, prevent, and respond correctly. So prepare yourselves, not just the wardens, remember, it's all occupants of all buildings. If they're visitors, you can't do much about them. But of course, just preparing people to make sure they know of emergencies, they understand what the building does, and making sure we're dealing with getting them prepared for that situation. Prevention is the best measure, obviously. We don't want to respond to emergencies if we don't have to. So checklists, gap analysis, inspections are so good to use to make sure we're preparing ourselves properly and preventing the emergencies from actually occurring. If we need to respond to it, training frequencies, making sure wardens are trained on a 6-monthly basis. That's in accordance with the Australian standards. Occupants are done at least annually, so general staff members or even just residents, they're told of the emergency procedures, reminded of them, because every building does different things. I'm sure Chong Chi will mention it in his last comments, that we need to know what the capacity is of each of our buildings to make sure that we respond to them accordingly. Brad, something you mentioned earlier about the Grenfell disaster, the fire was on the outside. Before that, no one had ever trained people on how to deal with a fire on the outside. We always said, hey, the fire's on the inside. In residential buildings, stay in your rooms, stay in your rooms. Obviously, that wasn't the right call in that situation because the fire was the outside and can get in a lot faster. So it would have been better to leave. So it's an interesting situation. But if we make sure we educate ourselves, use those checklists, respond to it accordingly, we should be able to reduce the risk of any occupants in the buildings.
Yeah, great. And Chong Chi, your thoughts?
Well, that means we all know that fires in the building essentially resulted from the source, and the source is obviously a function of the building and the occupant. So we need to deal with accidental fire start and then the deliberate fire start. So in terms of deliberate, we talk about surveillance and to make sure that you can only do this much, obviously, during the daytime and the evening time. If someone wants to set a fire in the building and during the odd times in the early part of the morning, there is little you could do about it. But to make sure that you do have a surveillance camera to make sure that to deter that operation from taking place. And the other thing is to minimize the effects of fire. Basically, smoke and toxic gases, the heat, they are all time dependent. And then the buildings designed with compartmentalization to make sure that they do not spread. And then there's a reason to maintain compartmentalization so that it will not spread from one compartment to the next compartment, so that allow time for other people to evacuate. And as you all know, we talk about risk level is very low during working hours because you and I, at the end of the day, you and I were awake and aware we're the best detector in reducing any severe fire risks. And from a management perspective, we talk about reducing fire start, restricting the size, emergency management as explained by Adam, and a risk assessment, basically the ongoing risk assessment to make sure that the environment is safe for people to occupy.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Chong Chi. And that takes us to the questions point in time where you, the audience, now get the opportunity through the Q&A function, I believe, Sarah, to ask questions of the panel members. Whilst you're considering the questions that you'd like to ask, I'd like to draw your attention to this QR code. It will take you to some downloadable content from TrimEVAC and from Greencap. You'll get an unpacked fire safety advisor information sheet from TrimEVAC, and you'll find a managing fire safety risks and compliance advice sheet from Greencap. So help yourself to that information, and I will ask Sarah to reach out to the audience on questions that you might have.
Thank you, Brad. I did share that link also just now in the chat. So the first question from Anonymous is, hi, Dr. Chong, I am from Singapore. Is it mandatory to have a FSM in a private/MOE international school?
Well, I would like the acronyms to be explained.
All right. Well, maybe that person can clarify those acronyms further down.
That would be great. Yeah, in Singapore context. Yeah.
Okay. So Hovan asks, in regards to training, is it mandatory for fire wardens or the chief warden to complete the accredited courses offered by external training providers? Are internal warden training sufficient?
You're on mute, Adam.
And take myself off mute. Thank you very much. Yeah, so there's actually obviously two questions there. So fire wardens or just wardens in general. So remember, I try and, as much as possible, not use that word fire for wardens, because our wardens, no matter where they are in the world, should be trained to deal with all different types of emergencies. There's 58 different types of emergencies that can happen in a workplace or wherever we are. So make sure your wardens do know how to deal with not just fires, everything that can happen out there. Do they have to be accredited training? No, it doesn't. With Australia specifically, so we talk about in the regulations or potentially any state, it doesn't specifically say you have to use accredited training unless Queensland, different story. But you need to do compliance training. It needs to follow some sort of structure. The best way of doing that is through the Australian Standard 3745. Internal warden training significant. Well, there's one thing that it mentions in the Australian Standard. So whoever's facilitating the training has to have significant emergency management background. So they have to know what they're talking about. They have to give examples of how things have occurred and how we can use them to prevent things into the future. If you have someone like that, you probably can do it. Most workplaces don't, and that's why they kind of engage companies like TrimEVAC, so part of Greencap. We're just compliance driven. We're not an RTO. So we just go through those things that are really relative to buildings, specific to the buildings. If I can actually say with accredited training, it talks about everything. It's not specific. So doing a focused competency-based training is the best way to look after your staff members.
Okay, back to that clarification. The anonymous has said, is it mandatory to have a fire safety manager, that's CFSM, in a private Ministry of Education international school?
If you're talking about Singapore context, I believe.
Yep.
I think the fire safety framework in Singapore is covered under the civil defense, as far as I understand. And whether or not these are mandatory in the context of Singapore environment, to be honest, I can't comment much about it because I haven't done a lot of work in Singapore other than understanding that there's a civil defense in Singapore that regulate all these fire safety requirements. I hope that answers the question from our participant from Singapore.
That's because I'm muted and asking people questions when I'm on mute. Sorry. Pevlin asks, please clarify the options for door handles on fire exit doors.
Yep, Shang-Chi, you want to get that one?
I think the BCA has got a requirement in terms of single-handed action that allows you to basically just open it, and whether with the hand or with your elbow, for those people who are incapacitated in some degree, and those allows you to, those are the requirements. And sometimes you tend to see people, old buildings have got the doorknobs and so forth. And look, they were there for a reason, because the single-handed action allows anyone who are approaching the door to be able to, we believe, to be able to open the door with the hand, as I said just now, or with the elbow. Whereas in the round doorknob situation, sometimes sadly for certain people with arthritis and all that, there may be a challenge for them to twist and turn the doorknob. So that's why the regulation changed to those single-handed action.
Yeah, and it's always been the requirement that a door should be opened by a single-handed action. The current requirement is a single-handed downward action or pushing action. The previous codes were written in the context of a single-handed action. So something like a doorknob was quite adequate under the old codes. But Building Code of Australia, which has been in effect for over 30 years now, the requirement has been a single-handed downward action, which is typically a lever handle, downward action lever handle, or a push action type, so something like a panic bar or some other kind of push type device. And as Chong-Chi said, done that because not everyone has great mobility, and so lever handles or push action really do lend themselves to being able to open those doors or delatch the doors without any intricate hand movements that would have been allowed under the old codes.
Okay, so Hovan asked, what is the building owner's responsibility around the inspection of building cladding and fire safety?
Yep, Chong-Chi, want that one?
Yes, I think at the end of the day, if a fire occurs in a building, whether or not it is a tenant's fault or certain thing hasn't been maintained, or whether is it because of certain storage and what have you, and when it goes to the court, it will always follow all the way up to the chain where the asset owner will get a question about the building that's in question. So you cannot how will I say that, you could not delegate that part of that requirements to even to the tenants, and then you can enforce it to make sure that the tenants maintain and inspect the building. But at the end of the day, it has to, if from the regulatory framework, the asset owner carries the maximum responsibility in terms of making sure that that the building is safe.
I mean, it's always been the case that external cladding on high-rise buildings has to be non-combustible. That's been around for many years. It's just that some products that shouldn't have gotten through and been approved by certifiers have been, and that creates an interesting legal argument in terms of how the costs are pursued in relation to the defects. But you know, it's actually the case that there's nothing really new about, you know, controls on combustible cladding on high rise. You've never been able to do it, never been allowed to do it really under the building codes anyway. So it's come to light because of this high profile incident 4 years ago. I still can't believe it was 4 years ago. And so, yeah, there's a lot more scrutiny on what's actually ended up on the outside of these buildings.
Okay, so Natalie asked, do exit doors have to open towards the flow of traffic?
I'll get that one. So it's important to distinguish between an exit door and a door in the path of travel to an exit. Sometimes what people see as being an exit door is in fact a door in the path of travel. And I guess if you think about what an exit door is, it's really a door that leads directly to the outside. So it's the door on the perimeter of the building, or it's a door into a fire isolated stair, so into a fire stair. But it's not a door, for example, if you're in a retail tenancy and your retail tenancy opens into an enclosed mall, that door is not an exit door, it's a door and path of travel to an exit. The exit doors are actually then, you know, the auto doors off the mall, or the fire stairs off the mall as well. So an exit door, yes, must swing in the direction of egress, but a door and a path of travel does not need to swing in the direction of egress. So that's the key difference. There are certain concessions, though, in the code. For certain small areas, a door is allowed to open inwards, and the older codes pre-BCA did allow for a door to swing inwards, an inward swinging door. So that was allowed under the old codes. The building code has basically changed that, or put more strict requirements around that for exit doors to open in the direction of egress. So yes, open outwards effectively.
Okay, there's a few coming through the chat panel, but one more on the question. The organisation I work for leases halls and public spaces to community members for events. What is our obligation to the leasee in regards to induction, etc., in emergency management should a fire or evacuation incident occur?
Yeah, I'll look after that one. So it's the owner of the building's obligation to ensure that they have an emergency plan in place. So if you're leasing a space like a community hall or somewhere that is going to hold an event, the best thing that you should be doing is making sure when you are leasing those areas, ask for the person who owns the building or who you're leasing it off of, do you have an emergency plan, and is it identifiable up on the wall? So they should have some sort of pictorial that has the floor plan, where the assembly area is, and it clearly identifies that we do have a plan in place. As for training wise, like, you don't have to do a full on hour-long training session, but you do need to be just given a brief overview of what the plans are, if there are alarms in place, where the assembly area is, and what contact numbers need to be used in the case of that emergency. We know in Australia it's always 000 for our emergency services, but some buildings that you do lease, there should be sort of a secondary number, so whoever owns the building to be notified of something happening as well.
Okay. Mark asks, what is the best practice for where the emergency management department should sit in a larger organisational structure? Is it best practice for them to come under the WHS department or building facilities or operations or something else?
What a loaded question. It's an interesting one. I almost have to say it's going to come down to buildings individually of what the best situation is going to be. I do have a lot of clients I look after that do have their EPC, their emergency planning committee, being a part of their work health and safety team. Sometimes things get crossed over and confusion can be set in place, because when you're doing your EPC, there are some set questions you can get out of the Australian standards to make sure you hit those questions when you're doing your reviewing process. So my opinion really is to have your management team, so the people that are the leadership of your company, be a part of that EPC so they can just hear. It only takes an hour to go through this meeting. What's being prepared, maybe what's being changed, maybe they've got something to say about renovations coming soon and they'll need to go through this practice in 2 months' time after the renovations occur, because we're changing our emergency procedures and floor plans. So I would suggest, I can't tell any of you to do this, but definitely your management team should have a say in it, especially because at the end of the day, it is going to be held on them if something happens and they haven't shown best duty of care to their staff and informing them of emergency procedures. Worst case scenario, someone unfortunately passes away. Questions will be asked of the management team. What did they do to try and prevent this?
Okay, Mark also asks, is the Queensland Fire Safety Advisor requirement for an internal company officer to do this role, or are companies contracting it out?
So it can be both. That's QR code that's still on the screen. When you have a look at the document that's called the TrimEVAC Unpack Fire Safety Advisor in information, I basically put that together to help this exact question. So thank you for asking this question. Some companies require an FSA in Queensland, some don't. It depends on how many staff members you've got and how big your building is. Those two things are answered in that document. You're asking if you have to have it internal or external. It can be both. But the person who is your fire safety advisor needs to go do an accredited training session. So going back to that question of accredited or compliance, this is the only thing in Queensland specifically that must be accredited. Person does a 2-day course to go through how to fill in that inspection list, making sure they're preempting any emergencies, preventing them, like I said before, and actioning and putting an action plan together to fix things.
Okay, so Steve says contractors creating penetrations in firewalls is also an issue in refurbishment or lack of intumescent remedy when completed. I don't know what that means, but you might.
Yeah, I think we tend to see that when after refurbishment work, sometimes contractors would drill a hole through a firewalls, and then and then it's left without properly sealed. So the regular audit will pick up those situations. In fact, before the contractors even work on any fire compartmentalization, property managers should brief the contractor to say that if you make any penetration through those walls, it needs to be reinstated. And yes, we do see many penetrations in the building that are not sealed properly, and then industry has got various fire seals materials that could be used to make sure that you maintain the integrity of the firewall or the fire slabs. Yeah, it's quite a common issue. Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen asset owners implement or facility managers implement a permit to work system specifically for penetrations through firewalls or fire floors, because it's just gotten out of control where random trades have turned up and run cables and have just walked away and leaving a big hole in the firewall. So that I don't know how effective that system is, but I guess they're making an effort to try to close the gap on that.
Sorry, again muted. Annual fire statements. What type of premises must complete these or have them prepared? That's from James.
I think in most jurisdictions and most states, the regulation call for class 2 buildings to class 9, which are your common office buildings, retail, industrial buildings, healthcare, individual dwellings like our home. We do not need to complete an annual declaration. And but hotels, if the use of the building is for transient, for various type of occupants, yes, you do need to have annual safety certification every year. And so it is spelled out in the various jurisdiction. But basically, our dwelling, the home that you live in, you don't need to complete a declaration every year.
Yeah, James, if you're referring specifically to New South Wales, it's class 2 to 9, as Chong Chi pointed out. The other criteria is whether a fire safety schedule currently exists for the building. So if it's an old building that hasn't been touched since 1988, actually, 1st of July 1988, then that building won't need to produce an annual fire safety statement because it won't have a fire safety schedule. The concept of the fire safety schedule came about in 1988, and buildings developed or refurbed or constructed since then will have a fire safety schedule, and that was the trigger for annual statements. But across, as Chong Chi says, across the other states, there's different criteria as well. In South Australia, anything less than 500 square metres doesn't require what they call a Form 3, I think, Chong Chi, over in South Australia. So, yeah, every state does things a little bit differently, but generally speaking, class 2 to 9, which, as Chong Chi says, everything other than that sort of home that you live in, the house or a garden shed, but everything else is potentially captured by the AFSS process.
Okay, we've only got 4 minutes left, but we've got 3 questions from James. Does the panel have a view on the banning of AFFF for fire extinguishers, and what should employers be doing to source suitable environmentally safer alternatives?
Well, I'll just say that AFFF has proven to be quite an effective agent. Yeah, I understand environmental concerns in relation to it. I guess it's like the old halon, everything sort of moves on. Yeah, we all move on from chemical agents that are no longer considered suitable or environmentally appropriate. Halon was destroying the ozone layer. So we move on, but yes, hopefully, suitable agents will, research is being undertaken in these sort of areas all the time. So we just have to accept that some things that we were able to use in the past are no longer really appropriate going forward.
And Natalie asks, can the path of travel doors have the illuminated exit light over the door, or is this only for exit doors?
Yep, I'll get that one. No, exit doors themselves need those, but you're also obliged to provide directional signage so that someone actually knows how to get to the final exit. So that will often mean that doorways on the path of travel from where you happen to be in the building to the final exits, yes, should have illuminated exit signage over them, so you actually know, you can actually wayfind to that final exit.
Okay, and Karina asks, our building has a permit issued for its setup. During an event undertaken in a few rooms of the building, the organisers are changing access to exits or how attendees walk through exits. What assessment or service should we engage to ensure the changes based on the event still ensures we comply with the required exits?
Chong Chi?
Yep, I think it is very important that, remember just now when I showed the slide of travel distance and all that, when the travel distance change in a building, that would mean that you need to travel the extra meters to get to the exit. So if the arrangement of the venue or what have you then change the path of travels and extended travel distance, that needs to be looked into. And we have seen places where certain event takes place and then certain exits are not allowed to be used, and then there's an alternative route. Those need to be addressed as part of that event to make sure that you still comply with the very basic design intent of the building, to make sure that there's no extended travel distance that allows for the building. So yeah, it needs to be accessed.
Okay, so that is all of our questions today. and we're right on time, which is awesome. I have put a link there in the, well, I've put a few links in. 2 of them are resources in the chats that will also come via the email later. There's the QR code on your screen. You can also access it via that. And I've just put a link in for future webinars. And hopefully we'll have the Greencap team back again, I'm sure, in the future. So again, that email will go out later today with the full recording, all these links, the slides, everything. Keep an eye on your spam because sometimes they find their way in there. And I'd like to thank Brad. I'd like to thank Chong Chi and Adam for joining us today, and Claire from Greencap for helping organise this event. So thank you, everyone, and hope everyone has a great day, rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye. See ya.
Bye.